I'm going to be hosting with you guys for a few minutes and then I have to run, but I am going to be talking to Gareth Porter, who's an award-winning journalist and American historian and policy analyst. So can you tell us, I guess, a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'll take about 15 seconds, but we shouldn't take more than that. You know, I've been an independent investigative journalist, I guess, for the past 13, 14 years now. I was a journalist earlier in my life briefly when I was Saigon Bureau Chief for Dispatch News Service during 1971. And then I got sidetracked, or at least I went in a different direction, tried to be an academic on Southeast Asian studies. And finally, after the United States invaded Iraq, I decided it was time for me to become a journalist again. And that's when I began to cover US wars and international interventions, including the intervention with regard to Iran to put pressure on Iran and ultimately carry out the worst, most serious sanctions program against a government that was not making war in the history of humankind, as far as I know. So that's my story.
Very cool. How did you get, well, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious, but how did you end up becoming a WikiLeaks supporter?
Well, of course, I was covering international politics and US national security policy when the WikiLeaks documents were released by WikiLeaks. When I mean WikiLeaks documents, I mean the full hundreds of thousands of US diplomatic cables were released. And at one point, actually, I had an agreement with Julian Assange that I would get access to all those cables, and had assembled a group of about 10 independent investigative journalists who would divide up the terrain and try to address as many of the important ones as possible. And it fell through because I couldn't get a major institution, or an institution that had the wherewithal to do this, to provide the technical basis for carrying out this project, which would require some things that I didn't have. So I'm sorry to say that I never took on that project. But I was part of the volume that Julian Assange was the editor for, or WikiLeaks was the editor for, which had chapters on each of the major categories of WikiLeaks documents. I did the one on Iran, and I'm proud to say that I was part of that volume, which I think was a very valuable addition to the literature on U.S. foreign policy and national security policy.
Oh, it's amazing. So what do you think about what's been going on now? We're now past 6 months that Julian has had no phone calls, no internet, no visitors. What do you think their end game is here? And just what do you think of everything that's happening?
Well, it looks to me like the end game from the point of view of the people in the United States and elsewhere who want to bring Assange into the custody of the United States, ultimately, which clearly has been the US government policy now for many years. I think the end game is to somehow secret him away from the embassy, or to get the embassy of Ecuador to, in fact, release him, to give him up. And of course, the change of government in Ecuador has brought this objective into view for the United States. So it really is, I think, a crisis without any question. The situation is quite dire.
Yeah. What would you say to like a current politician or who would have power in the United States? Like if you could speak to somebody in the White House out of there, what would you say? What argument would you make on his behalf?
Well, that's the most important question, clearly, and I'm glad to give whatever insight I can offer in this regard. I think the key point here is that WikiLeaks represents a an opening, a really historic opening up of the secrecy that has surrounded the U.S. empire for so many decades. And I would argue that this involves a crisis that surrounds the entire U.S. political system and U.S. government, which is a crisis of the U.S. national security state, which I now consider to be the permanent war state. I think it has morphed into a permanent war state, and that has cost the American people not only $7 trillion in terms of the wars in the Middle East, but untold trillions more over a number of decades, which should have been used to resuscitate the U.S. economy, to keep the U.S. economy from essentially going down as it has in terms of the ability to produce goods and to provide real jobs that will give security to tens of millions of Americans. And instead, those trillions of dollars were spent, tens of trillions of dollars were spent on the U.S. Permanent war state, not only carrying out wars, but preparing for wars that the United States should never fight and presumably will never fight with Russia and China, as well as with other self-chosen adversaries around the world, including North Korea and Iran. And I think that this crisis has reached the point where there must be change, fundamental change, in the way the United States conducts itself in the world. That must be a radical change, and the WikiLeaks documents provide insights into the way in which the United States has conducted itself, which help to support a movement to make that change. So I think that is why it is in the interest of all Americans for Julian Assange to remain free and to carry on this work.
Agreed. If you could speak to Julian right now, what would you say to him? I mean, obviously he can't get online at the moment, but if he could, what would you want him to know?
Well, I hope he can, in some fashion, hear the interviews that are being done in support of his freedom and in support of what he's done over the years. And what I would hope he would hear is that his work is appreciated by people in the United States who are continuing to work under the umbrella, if you will, of WikiLeaks and of the opening that he has provided, the insights that he has provided and will continue to provide into the operations of the permanent war state. And by the way, I would consider that the documents that he made public from the Democratic National Committee files are really part of that overall collection of documents which provide insight, excuse me, that provide insight into the way in which the U.S. Permanent war state has operated. I mean, for example, and not just for example, but the most important example being the way in which Hillary Clinton tried to shut down the Bernie Sanders campaign, which was critical of the empire as well as critical of the Democratic National Committee. So all of this is terribly important for the American public to understand, and it's up to Americans, left, right, and center, to try to bring this message that Julian Assange has been working to make available to the world, but particularly to the American people, most importantly of all, to continue to bring that message to the public in the United States. And part of that message now is that it's terribly important that Julian Assange not be allowed to fall into the clutches of the US government.
Yeah. I mean, I worry about his health and his safety now every day. I mean, we don't know what's going on. We knew that he had health issues. He's had health issues for a while now. And now that he's unable to communicate with everybody, I mean, they could be accelerating. We just don't really have a good idea. I mean, obviously his lawyers are keeping people updated, but it's a really scary concept that he can just be completely cut off from the world. We don't even do that to death row inmates here in the United States, you know?
That's right. Yes, you're absolutely right. And this kind of treatment is historically unprecedented and needs to be highlighted or lowlighted, if you will, by the people who understand the significance of what the United States has been doing to try to isolate him, put him under this kind of pressure. And ultimately, I think still it's the case that they hope to gain direct control over Julian Assange.
Right. I feel like if this had happened or if any other journalist or publisher was being held in these same conditions, there would be international outcry. It's unthinkable. Like, it boggles my mind that people aren't, screaming in the streets every day about this. It's just a blatant human rights abuse, blatant attack on freedom of the press, on freedom of speech, and it's really unfortunate.
Yes, it is indeed an issue which does, I think, unite the left, right, and center as traditionally understood, but now sort of concepts that are essentially far less meaningful, if not meaningless. It unites people who would have at one time been identified in those ways to really be more active in support of what needs to be done and what has been done by Julian Assange.
What do you think the best things there's people all over the world who support him, obviously. What do you think, besides doing things like the Unity for J vigils, what other things do you think that people could do that would help to either raise awareness or, put pressure on these governments to help him?
Well, I think there are two things. One is for people to tune into one of the alternative media who have, in fact, been telling the truth about the issues that have been so completely misrepresented in the corporate media over the past decades, and which it's so important for Americans in particular to understand more clearly. And I think many people tuning in are familiar with some of the alternative media, but of course, the media that are going to be represented in the series of interviewers and interviewees are the ones that I have in mind. And I'm very happy to be part of the medium that is particularly involved in this, thanks to our editor Joe, who I assume will be involved in this more directly at some point. I don't know what his complete schedule is, but I assume he has either already been or will be involved.
The people who have been doing this have been amazing. Especially like Susie Dawson, Elizabeth Voss, people at Disobedient Media. They've been relentlessly working on this stuff, and it's amazing. But I don't know.
I just want to give a shout out to Consortium News.
Sorry.
Yes. This is there's Joe right there.
In fact, I'm here. Yes.
He's going to be on.
I'm going to be very involved because I'm taking over from Cassandra, who has to get.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I have to run. I'm sorry. I got to go cover the mayhem down in DC right now. So.
Thank you. We're both of us. Gareth is in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm in Alexandria.
Oh, nice. I'm heading to Alexandria.
I'd love to go down there as well, but I'm going to be taking over from you to continue the interview of Gareth. Thank you, Cassandra.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.